Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays. Do we have a spicy and controversial episode for you today? Because we are talking about Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, and a book I just finished called The New Jerusalem, and what they reveal about power, media, and basically the conversation that we should all be having, but a lot of us are avoiding. So at the end of last month, we started unpacking a big question. Where does real power sit in our country? And how does understanding history and theology change the way we see what's happening today? Well, the timing couldn't be more perfect because right now there's a viral clash unfolding that brings all of these threads together in real time. And as I just mentioned, I just finished reading the book, The New Jerusalem, Zionist Power in America by Michael Collins Piper, which was written way back in 2004 when I was graduating freaking high school, going to college as a freshman. I was just thinking, where was I in time? And I was totally too young to be really paying attention to this. And it discussed a lot of the same individuals and key information that Nick Fuentes just said in the two-part attack on Tucker. So I was constantly opening it up while I was watching it on Rumble, making notes in the sidelines and trying to tie all this together. The book is a deep dive into decades of political and financial influence shaping America. And as I'm reading it, this public duel is emerging between two of the loudest voices in alt-right media, Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes. We'll get to that later. And I really appreciated what Ian Carroll said, which is linked in the podcast blog, just about the whole subject. And he reminded us on why these kinds of debates aren't just entertainment. They're essential for discussing the truth and the health of our nation. So to be clear, this is not gossip or drama. It is about understanding the invisible lines that are drawn around what we're allowed to talk about, what gets filtered out, what gets shut down. And if we pay attention, this moment could help us move the conversation forward in ways that are desperately needed. So let's talk about the New Jerusalem and how he was mapping influence behind the scenes. And I mentioned in the previous episode about Christian origin story, how I truly believe that we have been an occupied nation since 1960s. And Michael Piper totally agrees. He wrote a 768-page book called The Final Judgment, the missing link in the JFK assassination conspiracy. And so that is just a whole nother ballpark. He also wrote a book called The High Priest of War, which was the first full-length work examining the little-known history of the hardline pro-Israel neoconservative movement, which Nick Fuentes was really breaking down for us in his Part 2 series in particular. And so, again, I am not an expert in this at all. I am just beginning to scratch the surface, be insanely humbled because I haven't been a conservative my whole life. I was a liberal, so I pushed back a lot on the far left ridiculousness, which has taken over culture and society. And then I started leaning a little more right, and I was just so ignorant about all of this. It's starting to make so much sense. So I'm just trying to point you guys into resources, not to propose myself as someone who can connect all the dots or who can even begin to understand anything nearly like what the author Piper did of his books, because he was just tracing networks, deals, consolidations of power that have shaped the American political and financial landscape over the last century. It's definitely a lot shorter and more entertaining than Whitney Webb's books, Nation Under Blackmail. I couldn't get through them, to be honest with you. They were so dry. So if you've read them, mad props to you. So for me, what stood out was the gradual centralization of influence from, and this isn't just from the 1960s, that's when they really took over our political establishment, but from banking to media to government appointments and these connections, you can say connecting the dots is anti-Semitic. The esteemed Webster's Dictionary has now broadened the definition of anti-Semitism to include opposition to Zionism, which is definitely a lot of what I speak about, and sympathy for the opponents of Israel. So those two categories alone would probably include literally billions of people across the face of this planet. So we need to understand that when people label folks as white supremacists, Nazi, anti-Semitic, cancel culture is over. So if y'all aren't picking up on that, you need to go to primary sources and listen specifically to what people were saying. Try to read books. Try to listen to different sides of the story so you can grasp the truth if you can. I don't know if that makes sense, but this really isn't a wild conspiracy. This book was a careful look at decades of patterns and documented facts, and most of the resources were from Jewish sources. Our current political reality didn't just appear by chance. It is a product of generations of social engineering, strategic moves, and powerful leverage. So without this historical lens, it's so easy to see today's media as just an organic mess of voices. And when I stepped into the conservative world, the Christian world, when 2020 happened and all my friends kicked me out for not getting the vaccine, for not going along with Black Lives Matter, I was so ignorant to all the factions and divisions and what it was like to be a conservative, the history of the movement, what the actual ideologies were. And that is kind of how I fell into being a Christian and even, unfortunately, supporting Trump at one point, which is disturbing to me. But I look back at it as a form of coping, copium, as Adam Green calls it. I was coping. And during this time, the pandemic, the shutdowns, I was exposed to evil and darkness in some of my research. And it's what really, when you're in the conspiracy world, that's that New Age to Jesus pipeline. It's that crunchy hippie to alt-right pipeline that has been researched. I got sucked into that. And I've talked about that on previous episodes. And I'm going to talk about that more when I bring on Dr. David Skrbina, the author of The Jesus Hoax. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in the episode. But back on topic, once you see this historical lens of the Zionistic power and control in America, you will then see how much of what we hear, what we don't hear, like Nick Fuentes says, you'll never, ever look at politics the same. You just really won't. So much of it is carefully shaped and rarely talked about openly. Okay, so what kicked all this off was an interview on August 1st, 2025, when Tucker Carlson sat down with Candace Owens. During a 15-minute segment, they launched a personal attack on Nick Fuentes. And Candace had Nick Fuentes on an interview beneath a paywall. She completely embarrassed herself, whether you're a fan of Candace or not, whether you're a fan of Nick or not. And I watched it on Dr. Carlin Borseco's YouTube because it was behind a paywall. That's beside the point. But what we're trying to say is the spark of all this issue was Tucker claimed in that interview with Candace he didn't know his dad was in the CIA until after his father's death this year of March 2025. And a claim that most of us know is a blatant lie. And that lie is what set off a firestorm with the Groypers, and in response, Nick Fuentes dropped a 2-part viral series on Rumble calling out Tucker for being dishonest, for being part of the CIA, for working with his dad on all sorts of stuff like the Iran-Contra deal, which ties into the Epstein stuff. Holy moly, dude. Whew. Most importantly, though, Nick Fuentes says that he's not pushing far enough on certain topics. Fuentes argues that there are very clear lines that Tucker won't cross, and those lines shape what millions of people get to hear. So whether you agree with Fuentes, Tucker, Candace, or not, this public clash, I think, is kind of rare. Usually these kinds of disputes might stay behind the scenes or get smoothed over, but this time it's happening right in front of us. I feel like there is a conscious awakening happening about the power that Israel has in our, not just the AIPAC lobby, but there are so many other organizational packs, and just how their wealth, their influence, it's painfully obvious once the veil is pulled back, and incredibly scary, honestly. What I mean is the audience is given a rare look at the invisible boundaries of public discourse, the unspoken rules about what topics are quote-unquote safe and which ones are off limits. And once you notice those lines, it starts to natural to ask, who drew them and why? That's what I mean by cancel culture. When people are censored and kicked off, we have to start asking, well, why? And let me come to that conclusion on my own. I absolutely hate censorship and policing of thought. So if you want to see the full exchange and judge for yourself, I have linked part 1 and part 2, which is the viral response part 2, which starts at 1 hour and 40 minutes in the episode blog. And so watching these, I think, like I said, go to primary sources, think for yourself, and you'll see why this clash has grabbed so much attention Nick Fuentes does a good job at showing the clips from the Candace Owens Tucker interview. Like, you don't have to go chasing anything else down. Just go check out. You'll get all the information you need from those two Part 1 and Part 2 series. I also linked Ian Carroll's video earlier in the blog. So if you want to check that out, that was pretty short and sweet. Gives a pretty good summary of everything. If you don't have time to watch Nick's 1.5, 2-hour rants, but you should because they're historic. Okay, so now this ties into something I've been noticing from some corners of the internet. People who have moved away from Protestant church and have embraced Orthodox Christianity, rightly pushing back against things like Zionism and dispensationalism. But on our last episode, I specifically mentioned how it's not just dispensationalism or the Schofield Bible that's fueling this whole machine. It's that Christianity itself is built on Jewish roots. Inside every Christian is a Jew. Pope Francis, June 16th, 2014. Reading from the book The Jesus Hoax, consider, first of all, the ancient origins of Judaism and the corresponding events of the Old Testament, otherwise known as the Jewish or Hebrew Bible. The original patriarch, Abraham, originally called Abram, strange how so many people in the Bible have two names, allegedly lived sometime between 1800 and 1500 BC. He was the traditional father of not only Judaism and thus Christianity, but centuries later of Islam as well. Thus, one sometimes reads that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all viewed as the Abrahamic religions. Podcast listeners, in the blog, I have a photo that I want you to look at, the family tree of Abraham, which is a figure from the Jesus Hoax book by Dr. David Skrbina, which we will have him on in a few weeks to discuss it. But I want you to look. It's Abraham who had Ishmael, and that's where the Arabic people come from. And then we have Isaac who had Esau, which are the Edomites, the Europeans, also known as the West. And then we have Jacob/Israel, which are the 12 sons, the tribes of Israel, which is going to be Judah, which is Jesus' line. So I've kind of broken that all down, and it was something I made on Canva based off of a figure in the book. But simply put, Christians believe in a Jewish God, they read Jewish scriptures, and worship a Jewish rabbi. So if you take those origin stories, like the biblical, like if you believe in biblical inerrancy, that the Bible is true, that it was written by God, that the God of creation, the God of this world is a Jew and was written by Jews. I mean, if you believe all of this is little history, you are only reinforcing the very narratives that prop up modern Zionism. And my beef, this is where my beef comes in. In a recent clip, one of my friends and a big voice here claimed that Jesus wasn't really a Jew, just an Israelite from Judah, as if that somehow changes his identity or the core of the faith. And so, podcast listeners, the clip is in the blog. I do think it's easier to watch this, and I know I don't do video podcasts. Sorry, I think video is overrated. But you want to watch the clip, it's in the blog. I will tell you, it is a conversation between two people, even though it's just the same content creator. She does a lot of this format where it's like a Protestant Christian having a conversation with an Orthodox Christian. And so the first person speaking is the Protestant Christian, and then she's always now, because she's so enlightened as an Orthodox, or going through the catechism or whatever it's called, she's always schooling how Protestants are wrong.
You have to support Israel if you're a Christian. Jesus was a Jew after all. You're misinterpreting the notion that Jesus was from the tribe of Judah, just like the prophet said. So you're straight up going to deny that Jesus followed Judaism? Definitely not in the way that you're thinking. The Judaism of Jesus' time didn't look anything like today. It was the old covenant, temple worship, priesthood, and sacrifices, and that's what he fulfilled. Which is why the Orthodox Church looks like it stands still in time in comparison to some of these things. Modern Judaism is a little bit different. It developed after the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. They no longer had sacrifices, and they no longer had the temple, and they definitely didn't recognize Jesus as the Messiah. So he wasn't Jewish like Jews are today. He lived as a faithful Israelite, under the law in order to fulfill it completely. Then he gave us the new covenant in his blood. The law was a shadow, and Christ is the reality. So, is that why most Christians don't keep, the same feasts and all of the laws and everything like that? They all still point to him. And in some way or another, we still celebrate the fulfillment of these things. So, tribe of Judah, yes, but modern rabbinic Judaism, no. Right. We follow Christ and his church, the Israel of God. where Jew and Gentile can come to be united with him.
There it was. Jesus isn't a Jew, folks. I mean, I have heard Adam Green from No More News talk about coping Christians online that say this, but I'd never heard it because it's historically inaccurate. I have a much more detailed pushback in my blog, and I want you to check that out. And it's from the book, The Jesus Hoax, which I've been referencing a lot because it's very fascinating. And he references his sources in the book and can explain it much better than I can because he's a scholar. But Abraham in Genesis is called the first Hebrew. Israel is Jacob's new name, and all of his descendants are Israelites. Judah was one of Jacob's son. His tribe's people have become known as the Jews. And we break down the whole history of how that works out in my blog. Jesus was from Judah and lived a fully Jewish life. Jesus had to be a Jew in order to be the Messiah that everyone believes in. So saying Jesus wasn't a Jew is such a dodge, it's not history. And we should set the record straight that the Orthodox tradition definitely affirms that Jesus was Jewish both by lineage and practice. For example, Orthodox Wiki notes that Jesus is the Messiah prophesied by Jewish prophets, and the Gospel of Matthew was written especially for a Jewish audience because all of the first Christians were Jews. They've even shown that they were the first temples and worship places. They had one door for Gentiles and one door for Jews. This emphasizes how Jesus, his fulfillment, was of Jewish prophecy. Christianity is Judaism light. Stop coping. Stop lying to yourself. You do not stop the power of Zionism. You do not stop the power of Israel and our government by worshiping a Jewish Messiah. The Orthodox Church in America website, all linked in the show notes, points out that Jesus was a long-awaited Jewish Messiah who lived fully within the Jewish covenant community, even though some of his contemporaries refused to recognize him as such. So just like there's lots of different versions of Protestantism, or I'm sure there's different versions of Orthodox. I know there are different versions of Orthodox who kind of disagree on probably the Trinity anyways. There's always different sects. And so when she says that Jesus wasn't like the Pharisees or the Sadducees, that's true. Jesus was a zealot, perhaps, or Jesus was part of the Jewish mystical tradition like Paul. Definitely Paul and Jesus were from the same sect, which is potentially a zealot military force. I mean, this is all sorts of history that a lot of Christians probably don't want to look into, but historical records in the Gospels show that Jesus was born in the tribe of Judah, descended from David, circumcised according to Jewish law, faithfully observed Jewish festivals and customs. He taught in the synagogues and affirmed the Torah and all the prophets. Luke 4:16, John 7:2 and 10, Matthew 5:17 through 18. And this is why I'm bringing on Dr. David Skibina, the author of The Jesus Hoax, who I've referenced a million times. I think you should read the book if you can handle it, in an upcoming episode later this month. Because when you start questioning who Jesus really was beyond the narratives that have been handed down or pushed by certain agendas, you begin to see how much history, theology, and culture have been very carefully shaped. And as with all political power and media, truth often lies just beyond the boundaries that we're allowed to explore. And why this matters. This isn't just about one book or two media figures or some random chick on Instagram. It is a rare opening, let's say a crack in the matrix that lets us see where conversations get shut down or maybe even push those limits back. I mean, we remember the censorship during COVID. Like I said, agree or disagree with Piper, Fuentes, Carlson, that's your right. But the bigger question remains, who decides what's okay to say? And if those decisions are made without our awareness, are we actually free? How free really are we then? That question feels especially urgent today as laws around hate speech and anti-Semitism shape what we can discuss publicly and ways that limit honest dialogue. Efforts like DEI programs aimed at protecting Jewish students, linked in the show notes, Glenn Greenwald, who is also a Jew, calling out this hypocrisy, considering it completely contradicts how most conservatives feel about identity politics. So my hope is that we take this moment seriously and we stop treating these boundaries as natural or unchangeable. We need to start asking who benefits from keeping the conversation so tightly controlled and whether that control is helping or harming society. Because once you see where this conversation ends, once you read some of these books that I've been talking about, you realize how much more there is beyond and how often that's actually where truth really lives. So that's all I have for you today, folks. Please take the time to check out the links in the show notes. Like I said, I didn't want to present a super long podcast breaking all this down. I just wanted to bring it to your awareness, put my name in the hat like that I am supporting this conversation. I think it is such an important moment in our nation's history, but I do not believe that we save our country by being Christians and believing in Judaism light. That's going to be a hard pass for me, which is why I have a future interview with Dr. David Skrbina, and I can't wait for that. So until then, stay curious, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in. Have a good week.